There are moments that never leave the heart, moments that echo through time, long after the guns fall silent. The winter of 1944 brought one of those moments. In a quiet Belgian village, under a sky heavy with snow, a small gathering stood in silence. It was not the roar of battle that marked this day, but a solemn farewell to a man who had once stood firm when the world was falling apart. Sergeant Jean-Luc Moreau had seen the worst of two wars, yet he had remained a pillar of strength for those around him. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a guide, a voice of reason, and for many, the last light in the dark. At his side, even in his final hours, lay Cooper, a loyal companion trained not for combat, but for comfort. That dog had stood beside him when few others could. Among those present stood a man often seen only in strategy rooms and newsreels, Winston Churchill himself. But here, there were no speeches, no politics, only a quiet respect shared between men who had faced the impossible. His eyes did not wander. They stayed fixed on the flag, the earth, and the memory of a comrade who had carried more than his share of the burden. This is not just a story of uniforms and ranks. It's a story of loyalty, of unspoken bonds, of the strength it takes to keep going when everything around you seems to fall away. And sometimes it's a story only a few have ever known, until now. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold still clung to the air like a secret refusing to fade. The chaplain stood with his hands wrapped around a worn Bible, his voice calm and steady as he spoke of honor, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity of men who had carried more than their share of the war's weight. Yet, just beneath those solemn words, something else stirred. Cooper, the trained British support dog, sat close to the coffin, ears alert, his body still but tense. A faint growl rumbled from his throat. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make a few heads turn. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, were locked on the wooden casket as if he sensed something no human could. Winston Churchill, standing near the head of the grave, noticed it too. He narrowed his eyes, taking in not only the dog's behavior, but the strange stillness surrounding the mourners. To his right stood Claire Moreau, the late sergeant's widow, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if searching for answers beneath the earth. Next to her, Lieutenant Adrien Moreau, Jean-Luc's only son, stood motionless. Not a single tear fell from his eyes. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched. Behind them, Dr. Elias Rutherford, a seasoned military physician and the man who had signed the death certificate, kept his gaze forward, lips pressed into a firm line. He didn't speak, didn't move. And yet in the stillness of that moment, something felt misaligned, like a frame ever so slightly out of place in a familiar painting. Churchill felt it, that unmistakable twinge in his chest. Not of sorrow, but of suspicion. He had spent enough time on battlefields to recognize when something didn't add up. And Cooper's reaction only deepened the sense that something here had gone wrong. Dogs, after all, had instincts trained not just by war, but by bonds. Bonds of trust, loyalty, and presence. Cooper had been by Jean-Luc's side in his final weeks. Whatever had happened, the dog remembered. Then, without warning, Cooper sprang forward. His front paws hit the coffin and he began to scratch, not frantically, but with sharp purpose, as if trying to uncover something hidden beneath the surface. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The chaplain paused mid-sentence. Murmurs broke the silence. A few soldiers stepped forward to restrain the animal, but Churchill raised a hand. "Let him be," he said quietly. His voice cut through the air like a blade. Those closest turned to look at him, uncertain. But Churchill's eyes never left the scene before him. In that moment, He wasn't the Prime Minister. He was a man who had witnessed too many losses, too many good people fading without reason, and too many truths buried deeper than any grave. Claire's shoulders trembled, though she said nothing. Adrian's eyes shifted, not in grief, but as if something inside him was unraveling. And Dr. Rutherford, for the first time, looked away. Churchill took a slow breath. "There is something more here," he whispered to himself. That moment, Cooper's growl, the widow's silence, the son's dry eyes, the physician's cold expression would not leave Churchill's mind. In a war filled with chaos and sacrifice, most said there was no room for quiet mysteries. But Churchill knew better. Sometimes silence said more than 1,000 voices ever could. And on that cold winter morning in the Ardennes, as a loyal dog stood guard and a storm brewed quietly beneath a layer of calm words and folded flags, the truth waited. It waited in the stillness. It waited in the scratch of paws against wood. It waited in the eyes of a man who had seen the weight of war and refused to ignore the whisper of something unjust. It happened in a heartbeat. A sound so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind brushing against the trees. But it wasn't the wind. A soft, rhythmic thump came from within the coffin. Gasps spread through the crowd like a wave. For a split second, no one moved. Then panic took over. Soldiers looked at each other in disbelief. Some backed away, others froze. But Winston Churchill, whose hand had begun to tremble ever so slightly, stepped forward. His voice, steady and commanding, rang out over the confusion. "Bring tools, now." There was no hesitation in his tone, no room for doubt. He wasn't asking. From among the stunned crowd emerged an older American sergeant with a weathered face and shoulders weighed down by years of war. McAllister, a veteran of the Great War, a brother-in-arms to Jean-Luc Moreau. Without waiting for permission, he rushed forward. A few British soldiers followed, their training kicking in faster than their thoughts. Cooper howled beside them, not in fear, but desperation. His paws scratched the side of the coffin again and again, as if trying to break it open with nothing but willpower. And claws. The sound from inside came again, faint but unmistakable. McAllister and the others pried at the edges of the lid. Their hands were clumsy from the cold, but their urgency gave them strength. Wood cracked, nails groaned, the seal gave way, and then silence. Just as the lid lifted, a soft, broken moan drifted into the freezing air. Eyes widened. Claire, already pale, collapsed where she stood. Adrian stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat, unable to look away. And Churchill, he dropped to one knee beside the coffin. Inside, Sergeant Jean-Luc Moreau lay motionless, save for the slight rise and fall of his chest. His lips parted with a faint breath. His skin, pale and cold, still clung to life. Churchill reached in, took the man's hand, and held it tightly. "It's all right, old friend," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're back. We've got you." Chaos swirled around them, shouts, orders, medics being called. But none of it mattered in that one moment. All that mattered was the fragile hand in Churchill's grasp and the heartbeat that refused to stop. Jean-Luc's eyes fluttered open, glassy and weak, struggling to focus. His lips, cracked from the cold and lack of air, moved slowly. Barely a whisper escaped them, just enough for Churchill to hear. "They tried to silence me." The words hit harder than any gunfire. Churchill froze for a moment. Then, slowly he turned his gaze toward Dr. Elias Rutherford. The physician stood pale and rigid, hands trembling, his eyes darting as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. The weight in the air was heavy, not just with shock, but with the sudden sting of realization. Churchill's voice, when it came, was quiet, but sharp as steel. "Who else knew?" Dr. Rutherford hesitated. His mouth opened, but no words came. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. I only followed orders." That single sentence cracked the ground beneath them. What had seemed like a terrible mistake, a misjudgment in the chaos of war, now carried a different tone. It wasn't a tragic error, it was something else. Something calculated, cold, deliberate. Churchill's eyes didn't blink. "Secure him," he ordered. The soldiers around him, still reeling from the shock of what had just unfolded, didn't question him. Two stepped forward and took hold of the doctor, who didn't resist. His head hung low, shame and fear written across every line of his face. Churchill turned to the others. "I want a full inquiry now. No excuses, no delays." In that moment, he was not just a leader. He was a man fueled by betrayal, responsibility, and a promise to those who had trusted him. The war had many enemies, but betrayal from within, that was a different kind of wound. One that didn't heal with time or medals. The investigation that followed, led personally by Churchill, uncovered layers that reached beyond the battlefield. What lay beneath wasn't just medical negligence. It was a plan, hidden within the very ranks of those sworn to protect. A quiet conspiracy born in shadows, threatening not only lives, but the very fabric of trust holding the Allied forces together. And in that cold cemetery, where the line between silence and truth had nearly been buried forever, Winston Churchill chose to make a stand, not only for Jean-Luc, but for every voice that had almost been lost in the noise of war. In the days that followed, Churchill refused to let the truth sink beneath the surface. What had happened to Jean-Luc was no isolated mistake. It was the tip of something far more disturbing. With urgency and precision, he turned to two men he trusted, Captain Louis Tremblay of the French Intelligence Corps and Lieutenant David Holloway, a sharp-minded British officer with a keen eye for patterns others often missed. Together, they began connecting the dots. It started with medical files, quiet anomalies tucked between piles of paperwork, soldiers listed as lost in action, but with no reports from the field, no confirmed locations, no witnesses, only sealed reports and burial documents that seemed just a little too neat, a little too clean. Then came the common thread. Each missing man shared an uncommon blood type, one so rare that it stood out instantly once noticed. Churchill leaned over the files, frowning as he ran a finger along a column of names. "These aren't accidents," he said in a low, firm voice. "They're being chosen." The trail led them to a modest building at the edge of town, a funeral home used by the military for emergency burials. It was quiet, too quiet. No guards, no movement, just shuttered windows and a lingering chill in the air. Under the cover of darkness, Churchill, Tremblay and Holloway entered. What they found inside chilled them more than the wind outside. Stacks of medical records had been altered. Some names had been crossed out, others rewritten in unfamiliar handwriting. Hidden beneath the floorboards, they found a separate ledger, older, stained and handwritten. It listed dozens of soldiers, names they recognized, names the military had supposedly buried with honors. But these men hadn't been found on battlefields. They had vanished. American privates, British corporals, Polish scouts, Canadian radio operators, even Russian fighters known to have worked with the local resistance, all gone, all with rare blood types, all registered through this very funeral home. Tremblay's voice was barely above a whisper. "This isn't just theft, it's selection." Churchill closed the ledger and stared into the dark. The air seemed heavier now. Every step forward made it clear. They weren't chasing a mistake. They were uncovering something built with intention, buried deep within their own ranks. Something that reeked of cold precision and something far from over. The trail led them to the outskirts of Bastogne, where the snow fell heavier, muffling every sound like a warning whispered by the wind. The location was an old warehouse, once a medical sorting facility during the height of the winter battles. It had long been abandoned, left behind as the front lines shifted. But Churchill knew better than to ignore the forgotten corners of war. Darkness often hid where no one dared to look. This time, he went himself. Alongside him were Adrian Moreau, the son still haunted by the discovery of his father's near fate, Cooper, whose instincts had already proven sharper than any man's, and two sturdy Scottish soldiers, hand-picked for their loyalty and nerve. The group moved with purpose, Churchill at the lead, his expression grim, his mind clear. He would not allow this trail to go cold. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Dust clung to every surface. Crates, empty stretchers, rusted tools, all the remnants of a place that once held hope, now consumed by silence. Then they found the bags. Tucked away in a back room, hidden behind a false wall, were rows of military-issue body bags. But when they opened the first, the truth struck with brutal clarity. The bodies inside were untouched by battle, no signs of wounds or trauma. Yet something essential was missing: the organs. Every one of them had been taken, with surgical precision. Adrian stepped back, visibly shaken. One of the Scotsmen cursed under his breath. Churchill said nothing, his eyes frozen on the lifeless forms before him. These weren't casualties of war. They had been taken apart, piece by piece, far from the front lines. Then Cooper barked. The dog darted toward a section of the wall. Churchill followed without hesitation. They found a hidden panel, and behind it, a narrow passage that led to a sealed room. What lay beyond was worse than any of them could have imagined. In the dim light, chained to a rusted pipe, was a man barely clinging to consciousness. His uniform was Canadian, his face gaunt and bruised. He looked up with sunken eyes as they entered, lips trembling. "Jacob Muller," Adrian breathed. "He's on the list. He was marked as missing weeks ago." The man tried to speak, his voice cracking with effort. "They were going to use me, just like the others." Then he collapsed. Churchill knelt beside him, his jaw tight, fists clenched. There were no words left to soften what they had just uncovered. This wasn't just betrayal, it wasn't just corruption. It was cruelty, hiding in plain sight. He looked around the room, at the tools, the restraints, the signs of what had been done. And then, with a voice that carried the full weight of every name already lost to this nightmare, he said, "We're not facing enemies from beyond the line. We're facing monsters among our own." Back at headquarters, under the weight of undeniable evidence and growing suspicion, Dr. Elias Rutherford finally cracked. He had held on for days, denying, deflecting, retreating behind vague phrases and half-truths. But now, with documents laid bare, witness testimonies piling up, and the haunted eyes of survivors like Captain Muller echoing in his mind, there was nowhere left to hide. His voice broke the silence like a glass falling to the floor. "I didn't want this," he said, shaking, almost pleading. "I was forced." Churchill stood across the room, unmoving. His presence alone was enough to fill the air with tension. Rutherford could barely meet his eyes. "They threatened my family, my career. I thought I could manage it quietly, that no one would really get hurt." Churchill stepped forward. "No, one would really get hurt," he repeated, his voice cold and sharp. "Men vanished, lives were desecrated, and you managed it?" The truth spilled from Rutherford's lips in uneven gasps. He spoke of a hidden network, a shadow sector that operated within the Allied Medical Logistics Division. Not official, not visible, but very real, and at its head was a man hiding in plain sight. Ernst Vogel, a name that chilled everyone in the room. Vogel had posed as a humble funeral director, his accent soft, enough to pass, his paperwork flawless. But beneath the uniform and polished shoes was a collaborator, a Nazi agent planted deep within their own system. His mission had nothing to do with burials or medicine. He had used the chaos of war and the trust of the wounded to carry out something far more sinister. According to Rutherford, Vogel's plan was horrifying in its clarity. He selected soldiers with rare blood types and healthy internal organs, disguised their deaths, and prepared their remains for transport, not for burial, but for experimentation in occupied territory. Under the cover of fog and war, human lives had been reduced to lists, conditions, and supply routes. Churchill listened in silence. His eyes, usually steady even in the face of battle, burned with something deeper now. Not just anger, but betrayal. This had not come from across enemy lines. It had come from within. When Rutherford finished, the room held its breath. Churchill spoke slowly, each word deliberate and unshakable. We do not fight the shadows of tyranny, only to discover them hiding behind our own walls. He turned to his officers. Place him under watch. No special treatment. No more silence. At that moment, it became clear. The war wasn't only being fought in the fields, the trenches, or the skies. It was also a war for integrity. For the soul of the cause they were all risking their lives to defend. And Churchill would not allow that cause to be tainted from within. The night fell thick over the medical outpost, cold and quiet, too quiet. Snow covered the ground like a blanket meant to hide more than just earth. Inside, the guards rotated their shifts. The halls were dimly lit, and Winston Churchill remained at the command post, reviewing the details of the growing conspiracy that had shaken the very heart of their operations. But then Cooper growled. It was low at first, barely noticeable, but sharp enough to make Adrian look up. The dog's ears perked, his body tense. A second later, he barked loud, urgent and unrelenting. The alarm followed immediately. 3 shadows slipped through the far side of the compound, rifles in hand, moving with purpose. Their target, Ernst Vogel, the traitor held under armed guard. Shots rang out. The silence shattered as chaos erupted in the dark. Churchill was rushed toward the secure room by British soldiers, his presence shielded behind a wall of loyalty and discipline. Adrian, already nearby, took cover and returned fire alongside the others. A bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing his jacket and drawing a shout of pain, but he kept fighting. "Hold your ground," Churchill ordered, his voice echoing above the noise. "Protect the prisoner." The firefight was swift and sharp. 2 of the attackers were cornered and disarmed near the rear corridor. The third, Vogel's handler, managed to slip through the shadows, taking advantage of the confusion. Vogel escaped alongside him, vanishing into the dense trees behind the compound, but Cooper was already in pursuit. With no hesitation, the dog sprinted into the forest, following the scent through snow and mud, past roots and broken branches. The soldiers called for him to stop, but Churchill raised his hand. "Let him go," he said. "He knows what he's doing." Minutes passed like hours. Then, a growl, a cry, and silence again. When the soldiers reached the edge of the trees, they found Vogel pinned beneath Cooper's weight, his arm crushed by the dog's powerful jaw. The would-be escapee thrashed, but the mud and snow offered no escape. Churchill arrived moments later, his coat flapping in the wind, his breath visible in the frozen air. He knelt beside the dog, now standing guard over the subdued traitor. He placed a hand gently on Cooper's back, eyes filled with quiet pride. "You," he said softly, "are the dog of justice." Around them, the forest held its breath once more, this time not in fear but in quiet reverence for the loyalty, instinct, and courage that had once again turned the tide. The courtroom in London stood silent as the final witness took his seat. The air was thick with tension, not of doubt, but of justice long delayed. Months had passed since the chaos in Bastogne, but the weight of those nights still lingered in every word spoken, every name read aloud. Winston Churchill sat at the head of the tribunal, not as a judge, but as a living symbol of the resolve that had carried them through the darkest hours of the war. The gallery was filled with soldiers, medics, officers, all of them witnesses in one way or another to what had been uncovered. Jean-Luc Moreau sat in the front row, cane by his side, eyes misted over. In his hand, the leash of Cooper, calm, loyal, and ever watchful. Beside them, Adrian sat upright, the bandage on his arm long gone, but the memory of that cold night forever etched into his heart. Captain Jacob Muller, now stronger, stood when called and spoke of chains, fear, and the quiet courage it took to survive. But what sealed the trial were the secret radio recordings, captured by a young Canadian signalman named Thomas Leclerc. He had suspected something months earlier, recording transmissions from within the logistics sector, piecing together messages meant to stay hidden. His tapes played aloud, the courtroom holding its breath as voices once cloaked in secrecy revealed the twisted machinery behind the crimes. Ernst Vogel sat motionless, his face as pale as the day he was found. Around him, the remnants of the conspiracy, officers, handlers, collaborators, awaited the verdict. The sentence was unanimous: life imprisonment for crimes against humanity and conspiracy within Allied ranks. Churchill stood to deliver the final statement, his voice heavy with feeling yet clear as ever. This war, for all its guns and fire, is not simply a struggle between armies or flags. It is a battle between what we fight for and what we refuse to become. We will not allow shadows to grow within our own walls. We will not trade our honor for silence, and we will not step aside when justice calls. He paused, scanning the room, his gaze resting briefly on Jean-Luc, on Adrian, on the tired but defiant faces of those who had refused to look away. This conflict is not merely of nations, it is of values, and in this battle we shall not yield to darkness. Tears rolled down Jean-Luc's cheeks. He didn't hide them. Cooper nudged his leg softly, and the old sergeant placed a hand on the dog's head. In that moment, no medals were handed out, no trumpets sounded, but justice, long overdue, had finally arrived. And for the first time in many months, the war inside them all began to quiet. The square in Saint-Hubert was quiet that morning, not silent like a battlefield, but the kind of stillness that comes from reverence, a calm born from remembering, from honoring what once nearly went unnoticed. Families stood shoulder to shoulder. Veterans wore their medals, not for pride, but for memory. And in the center of it all, a bronze statue gleamed under the pale sunlight. It was Cooper, standing tall, eyes forward, forever frozen in a moment of vigilance. Beneath him, the simple words carved into stone: the one who found the truth. Jean-Luc Moreau, cane in hand, stood beside the monument. Time had worn on him, but he stood taller now, his eyes brighter, his voice steadier. Adrian, his son, in fresh uniform and newly promoted, stood close, with quiet strength. Claire smiled gently, her hand resting on Jean-Luc's arm. She had known pain, but today she chose peace. Winston Churchill stood at the edge of the crowd, his cane steady, his hat pressed to his chest. His gaze didn't move from the statue. His thoughts were elsewhere, back in the snow, in the shadows of betrayal, in the faces of men who gave everything and asked for nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of everything they had lived. Even in war, a light can be carried in the steps of a dog and in the courage of ordinary men. Cooper, now older but still alert, let out a single bark, as if to agree, as if to say, "We remember." Churchill smiled then, not with pride, but with something softer: gratitude. Not every story of war ended in silence. Some, like this one, ended in truth, in justice, and in the small, steady flicker of hope. He remained there long after the crowd had begun to move on, just watching, just remembering. And perhaps that was the most powerful thing of all. Not the battles, not the speeches, not the medals, but the quiet decision to remember again and again so nothing would ever be lost to time. Because this was never just a story about darkness. It was a story about what we choose to do when we find light in the middle of it. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in his place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans should be told? If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one, of loyalty, bravery, and the quiet strength that shapes history. Until next time, keep the memory alive.